The smell of burning corn filled the night air. 3 acres of it, my daughter's entire college tuition, turning to ash. My HOA president neighbor, Brenda, stood by the fence with a gas can and a smug smile, live streaming it to her friends. But the siren wailing in the distance wasn't for somewhere else. It was for her. She had just walked into my trap. What would you do if your HOA neighbor burned down your kid's future for Facebook likes? Tell me where you're watching from. Let me back up and tell you how this whole nightmare started, how one woman's greed and arrogance forced me to turn my family farm into a fortress and my life's work into a battlefield. My name is Charlie Fieldstone, and I'm a third-generation corn farmer on 8 acres in rural Ohio. This land isn't just dirt and crops to me, it's a living history. My grandfather, a man who survived the Depression with nothing but calloused hands and a stubborn spirit, bought this land back in 1953 for $300 and a firm handshake. He used to tell me stories about how, back then, it was nothing but a sea of cornfields as far as the eye could see, the horizon stitched together by endless green stalks under a wide-open sky. He and my grandmother built the farmhouse with their own hands, using timber they cleared from the back 40. Every nail, every floorboard holds a memory. Fast forward 70 years, and that sea of corn has been replaced by a tide of suburban sprawl. I'm an island now, surrounded by McMansions with pretentious names like Whispering Oaks Estates and Heritage Glen. The irony is thick enough to choke on. There isn't a single mature oak tree left standing in Whispering Oaks, all of them having been bulldozed to make way for identical houses with 2-story foyers and 3-car garages. And the only heritage in Heritage Glen is my family's farm, a place these new residents treat like a blemish, like dog crap on their designer shoes. It's a constant, low-grade hostility, the feeling of being an exhibit in a zoo they'd rather see closed down. My wife, Denise, teaches 3rd grade at the local elementary school. She has the patience of a saint, which is a good thing because she's married to me. We have twin daughters, Sarah and Emma, both 18 and on the verge of leaving the nest for college. Sarah, with her gentle hands and fierce love for animals, wants to be a veterinarian. Emma, my little gearhead, is going for a degree in engineering. She can take apart and reassemble a tractor engine faster than I can. But college, as every parent knows, is a financial mountain. We're looking at $30,000 a year, each. And you know what pays for that? My corn harvest. Every single kernel represents a textbook, a dorm fee, a piece of their future. The sweet, earthy smell of corn tassels in late summer used to be my favorite thing in the world. It was the scent of success, of a promise kept to my family. Now, it just reminds me of everything I almost lost to one psychotic real estate agent. Enter Brenda Hartwell, 48 years old, president of the Whispering Oaks Homeowners Association, and a part-time house flipper with a reputation for being ruthless. She moved into the biggest McMansion in the development 3 years ago, a monument to vinyl siding and fake shutters, with a garage bigger than my entire barn. Her perfectly manicured backyard, with its in-ground pool and pristine patio furniture, that's right up against my property line, separated only by my grandfather's weathered oak fence, a fence that stood for over half the century. The trouble started last spring. She showed up at my front door one afternoon, clipboard in hand, flashing that dead-eyed, predatory smile that real estate agents perfect. "Hi, neighbor," she chirped, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We've had some complaints from residents about your farm equipment being visible from the street." I followed her gaze to my 1960 John Deere tractor, a beautiful piece of machinery I'd lovingly restored. It was parked exactly where it belonged, next to the barn. "Lady," I said, trying to keep my tone even, "that tractor has been sitting in that exact spot longer than your entire subdivision has existed." Her smile didn't falter, but it turned sharp, predatory. Several residents feel it's killing property values. My clients, who are considering purchasing in the area, are concerned about the rural aesthetic. Here's the kicker, the fact that made my blood boil. My farm predates their HOA by 40 years. My property lines, my deed, my zoning, none of it falls under their jurisdiction. I'm not a member, and I have no legal obligation to follow their ridiculous rules. But try explaining the finer points of property law to someone whose biggest crisis is a neighbor with mismatched mailboxes. This is a working farm, I stated, my voice firm. The equipment stays where it is. Brenda's eyes went ice cold. Mr. Fieldstone, she said, her voice losing all its fake warmth. Being a good neighbor means considering how your choices affect others. I'd hate for this to become unpleasant. Just then, as if on cue, my rooster, Hannibal, let out a defiant crow from his coop near the barn. The sound echoed across the yard, a perfect, rustic punctuation mark to our standoff. The sharp crunch of gravel under Brenda's heels as she stormed back to her pristine Lexus should have been my first real warning. I had underestimated her. I saw her as an annoyance, a suburban Karen with too much time on her hands. I didn't realize I was looking at an enemy commander preparing to lay siege. The real gut punch came 2 days later. I was out in the West Field, checking the irrigation lines, when I heard voices carrying on the breeze from the fence line. It was Brenda again, this time with a slick-looking guy in a $1,000 suit. She was pointing at my cornfield, her gestures expansive, like she was already planning the street names for a new development. 8 acres, she was saying, her voice filled with a salesman's confidence. Perfect for luxury townhomes. The farming situation is temporary. The suit, who I later found out was a developer from a big firm, nodded along, taking notes on a tablet. "What's your timeline for vacant possession?" he asked. Brenda didn't hesitate. 6 months, max. These old farmers always cave when you apply the right pressure. My blood turned to ice water. This wasn't about property values or a rural aesthetic. This was about commission checks and multi-million-dollar development deals. She was actively selling my land that wasn't, and would never be for sale. I ducked behind my grandfather's old tool shed, my heart pounding against my ribs with a rhythm I hadn't felt since my last tour in Afghanistan. The rough bark of the century-old oak tree behind the shed felt solid and real under my palm, a connection to the past. But everything else, my future, my daughter's future, my family's legacy, suddenly felt terrifyingly fragile. That night, the house was quiet, but my mind was a storm. I called Jake Thornfield, an old army buddy who'd traded his fatigues for a law degree and now specialized in agricultural law. "Jake, hypothetically," I started, trying to sound casual, "what happens if someone tries to harass a farmer off his land for a development deal?" Jake's tired laugh came through the phone. "Nothing hypothetical about it, Charlie. Happens all the time. Document everything. Every conversation, every incident, no matter how small. And Charlie, what's your 6? As I hung up, Denise came out onto the porch and handed me a cold beer. "Everything okay?" she asked, her eyes full of concern. I looked out across my land, the cornstalks rustling in the evening breeze, making the same sound my grandfather had heard every summer of his life. "Honey," I said, my voice heavy, "I think we're about to find out just how far people will go for money." The next morning, I found my main irrigation hose had been slashed in 3 places. Game on, Brenda. 3 slashed irrigation hoses might not sound like a declaration of war, but in the farming world, during the hottest, driest week of July, it's the agricultural equivalent of a targeted strike. When you're trying to keep 30,000 thirsty corn plants alive, water isn't just a resource, it's a lifeline. I spent the entire morning splicing thick rubber under a blistering 100-degree sun, the metallic taste of pure, unadulterated anger coating my tongue. This was sabotage, plain and simple. It wasn't just about inconvenience, it was a direct attack on my livelihood. I didn't have to wait long for the next round. On Tuesday afternoon, while I was out in the field checking the stalks for signs of stress, a White County-issued truck rumbled up my long gravel drive. Fire Marshal Dave Peterson stepped out, looking about as happy as a man on his way to his own execution. He was a good man, someone I'd known for years, but the clipboard in his hand felt like a weapon aimed right at my heart. "Charlie," he said, his voice low and apologetic, "sorry to bother you, but I got a formal complaint about illegal agricultural burning on your property." "Illegal burning?" I wiped a thick layer of sweat off my forehead with a dirty sleeve. "Dave, you know damn well I haven't burned anything since the spring cleanup, and that was with all the proper permits." He shrugged, his expression telling me he didn't buy it either, but he was bound by procedure. Someone filed a formal complaint online, he explained. Says you've been conducting unauthorized brush burning during state-mandated drought conditions. They even provided photos. My stomach dropped to my boots. Photos of what? Dave handed me a manila folder that felt as heavy as a gravestone. Inside were several grainy pictures of smoke rising from what looked like my back 40. Except it wasn't my back 40. The smoke was from Tom Henderson's controlled burn 3 miles away, a burn he'd had fully permitted. The photos were shot from a deceptive angle, deliberately framed to make it look like the smoke was originating from my property. The lie was so blatant, so malicious, it took my breath away. This is complete garbage, Dave, I said, my voice shaking with rage. That's not even my land in the background. Look, you can see the Henderson's red barn. I know, Charlie, I know, he sighed, the sound carrying the exhaustion of a man who had seen too many petty neighbor wars escalate into madness. But rules are rules. I've got to investigate every formal complaint that comes in. Mind if we take a look around? For the next 20 minutes, Dave and I walked the property while he went through the motions of his inspection. He confirmed what we both already knew. My fire safety protocols were military-grade perfect. My burn permits were current and properly filed. My fire breaks around the property were meticulously maintained. My water sources were clearly marked and accessible. He even complimented my grandfather's old stone fire ring, a structure I still used for controlled brush disposal. Back in my Army days, I'd learned a critical lesson about psychological warfare. When an enemy starts building a paper trail of false accusations against you, it means they're planning something bigger. They're laying the groundwork for a larger offensive. Brenda wasn't just trying to annoy me. She was trying to establish a pattern of negligence. Real estate agents, I remembered reading somewhere, can lose their licenses for making fraudulent claims about zoning changes or a property status. Brenda was walking a very thin, very dangerous tightrope, and she didn't even know I was watching. Whoever filed this either doesn't know a thing about farming or they're deliberately setting you up for something, Dave said as he climbed back into his truck, his face grim. Watch your six, Charlie. That evening, I installed my first security camera. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple trail cam from the hardware store, which I pointed directly at the equipment shed. The soft click of the mounting bracket as I secured it to an old oak tree was a familiar sound. It reminded me of setting up perimeter security in hostile territory overseas. A different enemy, a different kind of war, but the same fundamental tactics. Wednesday morning brought the diesel message. The acrid, chemical smell hit me before I even saw the dark, iridescent puddles spreading around the base of my main fuel tank. Someone had crept onto my property in the middle of the night and dumped about a gallon of diesel fuel into the sandy soil. It wasn't enough to cause any real environmental damage or ruin my fuel supply, but the message was clear and chilling. We can get close. We can touch your most critical assets whenever we want. That afternoon, I started researching Brenda's business practices. The county assessor's public website revealed exactly what I had suspected. On multiple online listings, she had been advertising properties in Whispering Oaks with the note, adjacent agricultural land expected to be rezoned for residential development soon. She was promising potential buyers that my farm would soon be gone, replaced by more McMansions. Except, no such zoning changes were even being discussed at the county level. In the state of Ohio, that kind of blatant misrepresentation is a serious ethical violation that can get a real estate license permanently revoked. Thursday brought the game changer I should have seen coming. I was out mending the fence Brenda's developer friend had leaned on when my neighbor, Harold Grayson, shuffled over, glancing around nervously like he was about to confess to a murder. Harold was 75, a retired postal worker who had lived on his small plot of land since before the Whispering Oaks invasion. Charlie, he said, his voice barely carrying over the evening breeze rustling through the corn leaves, we need to talk. What's up, Harold? I asked, leaning my shovel against a fence post. He took a deep breath. That Hartwell woman, she came by my house yesterday. Started asking questions about your schedule. When you'd be away from the property for long periods. His weathered hands gripped the top rail of the fence so tight his knuckles went white. When I didn't give her anything, she offered me $500 cash for any information I could provide about your safety violations. Safety violations I don't have, I finished for him, my voice flat. Harold's eyes, watery and full of a quiet sadness, met mine. That's when she suggested that I might start noticing some. The disgust in his voice was palpable. My late wife, Helen, used to love sitting on our porch and watching your grandfather work this land. She said it was honest work. Brenda, she's trying to destroy something beautiful for nothing but commission money. That's when Harold Grayson, a quiet man I'd only ever shared polite waves with, became my inside man, my most crucial source of intelligence. It turned out Brenda had visited half the neighborhood with similar cash offers. Most of our longtime neighbors had told her to take a hike, but a few of the newer residents, a couple who were clearly struggling financially, seemed interested in the offer of easy money. By Friday, my evidence folder was starting to get thick. I had photos of the diesel vandalism, official documentation of the false fire report from Dave Peterson, screenshots of Brenda's fraudulent real estate listings, and now, a first-hand witness statement about her attempts at bribery. But my real counterpunch was still those misleading real estate listings, which were still active on her company's website. I dialed the number for the Ohio Division of Real Estate and Licensing, my hand steady. Armed with screenshots of every false promise she had made in writing, I was ready to draw first blood. "Ma'am," I said when an investigator finally picked up, "I'd like to file a formal complaint against a licensed agent for making fraudulent claims regarding agricultural zoning." The investigator's interest was immediate and intense. Apparently, Brenda wasn't the first agent they'd been tracking for this particular scam. That weekend, I invested in more cameras and spent hours online, researching agricultural protection laws. On Sunday evening, Harold stopped by with a thermos of coffee and a fresh piece of reconnaissance. "Brenda's having some kind of war council over at her house tonight," he reported. For expensive-looking cars showed up around 7. The distant sound of multiple engines starting and stopping in her driveway carried across the still evening air. Through my kitchen window, I watched the shadows of people moving behind her brightly lit curtains. They were planning their next move. "Let the games begin, Brenda," I muttered to myself, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "Your move." Monday morning brought Brenda's next chess move, and it was uglier and more invasive than I had expected. She had officially formed the Neighborhood Safety and Beautification Committee, which was basically a gang of bored suburbanites armed with clipboards and harboring serious grudges against anything that didn't come from a big box store like Home Depot. Their first soldier on the ground was Janet Kowalski, who rolled up in a spotless white Lexus that probably cost more than my entire annual seed budget. She parked right at my property line, the tires of her luxury SUV crunching on the gravel, and began photographing my barn as if she were documenting war crimes for the International Criminal Court. "Morning, Janet," I called out, walking over with my coffee mug in hand. The bitter taste of the day-old grounds in my cup matched my mood perfectly. "Something I can help you with?" She jumped, startled, like I'd caught her in the act of stealing chickens. "Oh, Charlie," she stammered, her voice a little too high-pitched. "I'm just documenting some potential safety concerns for the committee." "Safety concerns," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. I looked over at my perfectly maintained equipment shed, the barn my grandfather had built, and the fields that were my life's work. "About what, exactly?" Well, she fumbled with her phone, her eyes darting back and forth as she clearly read from a script Brenda had prepared for her. "There's the proximity of your, fuel storage facilities to residential property lines, and the potential for vermin attraction from your composting practices." I almost laughed out loud, but the implications of her fabricated report weren't funny. My main fuel tank sat farther from her house than her own oversized barbecue grill. My compost pile, a model of agricultural efficiency, met every single state and county regulation in the book. This wasn't about safety, it was about manufacturing a pretext. "Janet, you've lived here for what, 6 months?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "My family has been following agricultural safety codes on this land since before your subdivision was even a blueprint in some developer's office." The guilty flush that crept up her neck told me everything I needed to know. Brenda had fed her the lines, and Janet, for whatever reason, was a desperate actress trying to earn her $50 payout. Over the next week, the committee members took shifts harassing me in a coordinated campaign. Tuesday brought Martin Cruz, a man with a suspiciously new pickup truck who spent an hour documenting dust concerns while my corn swayed silently in the gentle breeze. Wednesday was Susan Walsh, who called the sheriff's department to complain about my rooster's morning calls, the same rooster that had been crowing at the sunrise for 3 years before she ever moved in. By Friday, they were sending me certified letters demanding that I install expensive, high-end privacy fencing to hide my unsightly agricultural operations from their delicate suburban sensibilities. The sweet smell of sawdust filled the air as I spent Saturday morning repairing actual fence damage from a fallen tree limb. That's when Harold shuffled over, his face etched with a new level of concern and carrying intelligence that would change the entire battlefield. "Charlie," he said, his voice barely carrying over the rustling corn leaves, "we need to talk. I found out something about your committee friends." I set down my hammer and gave him my full attention. "I'm listening." Harold pulled a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping from his wallet, his weathered hands shaking slightly. "I did some digging on those people. This one, Martin Cruz. He's currently facing an insurance fraud lawsuit. The allegations are that he staged property damage on 2 separate occasions for big payouts." He then pointed to another name on a printout. "And Susan Walsh? She just lost her real estate license last year for forging inspection documents." My stomach dropped like a stone. Brenda wasn't just recruiting concerned neighbors. She was recruiting criminals. "It gets worse," Harold said, stepping closer and lowering his voice to barely a whisper. "I overheard her on the phone with Janet. She's offering them $50 for every documented violation they can report against you. She's literally buying false testimony." Now the whole ugly game made perfect sense. This wasn't about neighborhood concern at all. It was organized fraud, a deliberate, coordinated campaign designed to build a bogus legal case that would eventually force me off my land. My daughter's college money, my grandfather's legacy, everything I had worked for my entire life was under a full-scale assault by a team of paid liars. That afternoon, I dove into public records online like my life depended on it because, in a way, it did. It's amazing what you can find when you know where to look. Martin Cruz had indeed filed 3 suspicious insurance claims in the last 2 years, all for oddly similar incidents of property damage. Susan Walsh's license revocation was a matter of public record, and the state board's decision mentioned a pattern of document falsification. Even Janet's husband had a history of financial trouble, including a recent bankruptcy and a DUI. Brenda had assembled a crew of desperate people, individuals with flexible ethics who were easy to manipulate. They were the perfect soldiers for her army of fraud. But she had made one critical, catastrophic error. She had completely underestimated Harold Grayson. You see, Harold had watched this neighborhood transform from a community of family farms into a soulless suburban sprawl. His late wife, Helen, used to sit with him on their porch every evening, watching my grandfather work the fields. To Harold, my farm wasn't just an agricultural operation. It was the last piece of something authentic, a tangible link to a past that was being erased by vinyl siding and fake shutters. So, when Harold offered to wear a wire, or rather, use the recording app on his old flip phone to spy on the committee meetings, I accepted immediately. Wednesday night, 7 o'clock, he whispered during our Sunday fence conversation, his eyes gleaming with a newfound sense of purpose. "Brenda mentioned she's bringing in professional documentation specialists for the next phase." On a humid Wednesday evening, I watched from my kitchen window as the cars of the committee members gathered at Brenda's house like vultures circling roadkill. Harold's beat-up old Honda looked pathetic parked among the luxury SUVs, which made him the perfect, unassuming inside man. An hour later, he knocked on my back door, his face pale, holding news that made my blood freeze in my veins. "She hired a private investigator," Harold said, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. "A guy named Rick Poulson. They're planning to manufacture evidence." They were talking about planting dead fish by your creek to fake a chemical spill, using sound recorders to create fake noise violations during legal working hours. The room started to spin. When? I asked, my voice hoarse. Soon. Brenda's under a lot of pressure from her developer contacts. She promised them a timeline she can't meet. Harold gripped the cold beer bottle I handed him like it was a lifeline. Charlie, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, they're talking about staging something big. Something big enough to trigger a direct county intervention. That night, I didn't sleep. I was in my workshop, installing military-grade surveillance equipment. Infrared cameras, high-sensitivity motion sensors, even a few dummy units strategically placed to throw them off. The soft, electronic hum of the recording equipment became my lullaby. I also called Jake Thornfield again. Jake, what's the penalty in this state for conspiracy to file false government reports? Organized fraud, Charlie, he answered without hesitation. It becomes a federal crime if it crosses certain thresholds. Why? I just told him I was gathering more intel. The next morning, I found fresh tire tracks scarring the edge of my cornfield where someone had deliberately driven through during the night. A dozen or more plants were crushed, their stalks broken. Brenda's war was escalating. It was time to fight back. Brenda's next move hit me where it hurt the most. A calculated strike aimed at the heart of my operation. It came during the peak of the irrigation season, a critical time when my corn needed every last drop of water to survive the brutal August inferno. I was out checking the sprinkler heads at dawn, the air already thick with heat, when Harold's panicked voice cut through the morning stillness from his side of the fence. Charlie, county truck just pulled into Brenda's driveway. The sharp crunch of dried corn husks under my boots sounded like breaking bones as I jogged toward the fence line. My gut twisted into a cold, hard knot. This wasn't a social call. 20 minutes later, a water inspector named Carol Harris knocked on my door, holding a death warrant disguised as official county paperwork. She looked deeply uncomfortable. Sorry to bother you, Charlie, she began, avoiding my eyes. We received a series of complaints about excessive water usage from your property, alleging it's depleting the neighborhood's water supply. Your irrigation system needs to be shut down immediately, pending a full investigation. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at the cease and desist order, the official seal mocking me, and in that moment, I could literally see my daughter's college dreams evaporating in the sweltering heat. Carol, that's impossible, I stammered. My well has been here since 1953. It's on a separate aquifer. It has never affected anyone's water. I know this stinks, Charlie, but look at these usage numbers they submitted, she said, handing me a set of charts and graphs that looked terrifyingly official. They showed water consumption from my property at levels 3 times the normal for agricultural use. According to this data, you're using enough water to maintain a golf course. The numbers were pure fantasy. My grandfather's old well couldn't pump that kind of volume if it ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But someone, Brenda, had meticulously created official-looking documents, complete with forged data, that would fool any inspector conducting a rushed investigation. Who filed the complaint? I asked, though I already knew the answer. It was an anonymous tip, Carol said, then she leaned in closer, glancing around nervously and lowering her voice. But between you and me, Charlie, this feels orchestrated. Highly orchestrated. Get your own independent usage test done and do it fast. If these numbers are fabricated, someone is using county resources to wage a personal vendetta. As her truck disappeared down my long gravel drive, leaving a cloud of dust in its wake, I felt the metallic taste of real fear for the first time. Without irrigation, my entire corn crop would be dead within a week. 30,000 plants, $60,000 in lost revenue. Sarah and Emma's tuition money gone. But then, as I walked the property line in a daze, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A 20-foot-long strip of corn along my eastern property line, the section closest to Brenda's house, had turned a sickly, chemical brown overnight. It wasn't the yellow of drought stress, it was the dead, scorched brown of a chemical burn. The sickeningly sweet smell of herbicide hung in the still morning air like a poison gas. Someone had deliberately dumped industrial-strength weed killer on my crops. My trail camera. I had positioned one of my new, high-definition cameras to cover this exact section after last week's vandalism. Back at the house, my hand shook as I pulled up the encrypted footage on my laptop. I fast-forwarded through hours of silent darkness until 2:47 a.m., when a figure appeared on the screen like a suburban ghost. It was Brenda Hartwell. She was creeping along my fence line with a large, pressurized spray bottle, methodically and deliberately poisoning my corn plants. The infrared camera captured everything in chilling, crystal-clear detail: her determined face, the brand name on the herbicide container, even her Mercedes license plate when she carelessly tossed the empty bottle into the back seat. She had just documented her own felony. 3 hours later, I was at the Tractor Supply in the next town over, talking to my buddy Tom, who worked the counter. Their parking lot security camera had captured Brenda purchasing 2 gallons of highly concentrated Roundup the previous evening. It was a cash transaction, but her face was unmistakable under the flickering sodium lights of the parking lot. I now had her cold on multiple charges: agricultural vandalism, criminal trespassing, and felony crop destruction. In Ohio, intentionally destroying someone's crops is a serious felony that carries up to 5 years in prison. But something told me this was just the opening salvo of a much more dangerous final act. That evening, Harold shuffled over with a piece of intelligence that explained Brenda's escalating desperation. "She's in deep trouble, Charlie," he whispered, his eyes darting around as if enemy agents might be listening from the cornstalks. I overheard her screaming at someone on the phone about her development timelines. Apparently, her broker contract has some serious penalty clauses. "What kind of penalties?" I asked. "A $50,000 forfeiture if the land isn't available for development by October 1st. Plus, she loses the entire commission." Harold's weathered face looked haunted in the twilight. "Charlie, she's borrowed heavily against that expected money. If this deal collapses, she faces bankruptcy." The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Brenda wasn't just being greedy or malicious anymore. She was fighting for her own financial survival. Public records I pulled up later that night confirmed it. Her development deal with a firm called Midwest Corporation promised her a staggering $168,000 commission for delivering my 8 acres, vacant and ready for development. She had been spending money she didn't have, banking on her ability to steal my land through a campaign of fraud and intimidation. Now, she was trapped between the threat of criminal prosecution and the certainty of personal ruin. That night, I hired an independent hydrologist to conduct an emergency test of my actual water usage. It cost me $400 I couldn't really spare, but the official report he delivered the next day was devastating to Brenda's case. My well's consumption was 40% below the agricultural average for a farm my size. The data submitted to the county was a complete and utter fabrication. I also upgraded my security system again, this time with heat-sensitive cameras and a network of motion detectors. If Brenda was desperate enough to escalate to arson or more serious sabotage, I would capture every single criminal act in legally admissible detail. But the real revelation, the ace up my sleeve, came late that night as I researched agricultural protection laws online. I discovered that farmers in Ohio have special legal protections against harassment campaigns specifically designed to force land sales for development. Back in the 1980s, corporate developers used tactics identical to Brenda's to bully family farms into selling. In response, Congress passed the Agricultural Land Protection Act. The law was specifically designed to stop exactly what Brenda was doing. As I sat in my quiet kitchen that night, watching the automated sprinklers watering the perfect, green suburban lawns of whispering oaks while my own corn slowly died, I realized something incredibly important. Brenda had made a fatal, arrogant error. She had declared war on someone who understood both agriculture and military strategy. The sweet evening air carried the scent of her desperation, and I could almost smell her fear mixing with the lingering herbicide residue. It was time to show her what a real counterattack looked like. The bombshell that would ultimately change everything came on a Tuesday evening. Harold appeared at my fence line, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. His weathered hands gripped the wooden rail so tight his knuckles had gone completely white. Charlie, he rasped, his voice carrying a tremor I'd never heard before. We need to talk. Now. What I discovered tonight, it changes everything. I immediately dropped the wrench I was using to tighten a bolt on my planter. The metallic clang echoed unnervingly off the silent barn wall. Harold had never looked this shaken, not even when his beloved wife passed away last spring. What happened, Harold? I asked, my own heart rate starting to climb. I stayed late after yesterday's committee meeting, he began, his breathing shallow and rapid. Hid in Brenda's garage when everyone else left. You what? I was stunned. He was taking a huge risk. I overheard her, Charlie. Jesus, Charlie, she's not trying to force you out just for property values. My stomach dropped, a cold, heavy weight. Then what for? She's already got a development deal locked in. A signed contract. $2.8 million for your 8 acres. The words hit me like physical blows. My mind raced, trying to process the number. $2.8 million. The developer was planning to build 32 luxury townhomes, starting at $400,000 each. The world seemed to tilt sideways. My grandfather's land, a place built on 3 generations of sweat, sacrifice, and love for the soil, was being reduced to a line item on a developer's spreadsheet. A place for rich people who probably thought corn came from cans in a grocery store. That's impossible, I stammered. This is zoned as agricultural land. They can't build townhomes here. Not anymore, it isn't, Harold said grimly. He pulled out his ancient flip phone with shaking fingers. I managed to record part of their conversation. You need to hear this. The audio quality was scratchy, filled with static, but Brenda's voice cut through it all, as clear and sharp as a death sentence. Jim, she was saying, her tone confident, I can guarantee vacant possession of the property by October 1st. The agricultural situation is temporary. These old farmers always cave when you apply enough pressure. I've orchestrated this kind of thing before. A gruff male voice, presumably the developer, responded. Brenda, if this timeline slips, we're talking $50,000 in penalty clauses. Plus, you forfeit the entire commission. Can you absolutely deliver? Trust me, Brenda purred. I've got county officials building harassment cases for me. I have neighbors documenting fake violations, and if necessary. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that made the hair on my arms stand up. Well, let's just say farm accidents happen all the time. The recording ended, but her final, chilling threat hung in the hot, still air like smoke from a house fire. Harold's face had gone pale as winter wheat. Charlie, he choked out, she's talking about hurting you. In that instant, something inside me shifted. The familiar combat alertness that had kept me alive in hostile territories flooded my system. That hyper-awareness, the cold, calculating calm that descends when you realize death is actively hunting you. Harold, I said, my voice steady, you just handed me irrefutable evidence of criminal conspiracy, real estate fraud, and an implied threat of violence. This isn't just harassment anymore. This is organized crime. It gets even worse, Harold said, his voice cracking with emotion. She's borrowed against that commission money. She took out a second mortgage on her house, bought that new Mercedes, and paid for her daughter's entire lavish wedding. If this deal collapses, she's facing complete financial ruin. Bankruptcy. Now I understood. I finally saw the whole ugly picture. I understood the escalating attacks, the sheer desperation, the increasingly dangerous and reckless tactics. Brenda wasn't just being greedy, she was trapped in a prison of her own making. And cornered animals are always the most lethal. But this is where 20 years of military strategy and planning kicked in. When your enemy finally reveals their true objective and their greatest weakness, you don't just defend your position, you obliterate their operational foundation. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the glow of my laptop illuminating my face, researching agricultural easements until my eyes burned. And then I found it. A legal tool so powerful it was like a tactical nuclear weapon in a property dispute. I discovered that farmers in Ohio can file for a conservation easement, a legal designation that permanently protects their land from any future development, forever. The process takes about 30 days to be finalized, but once it's approved, the property becomes untouchable. It can be farmed, it can be sold to another farmer, but it can never be turned into a subdivision. Even better, the state of Ohio actually offers substantial tax benefits to farmers to encourage this kind of agricultural preservation. Brenda's $2.8 million development dream, the very thing she was willing to lie, cheat, steal, and possibly kill for, could be rendered legally impossible with the right set of paperwork. Dawn found me at the county courthouse, a thick stack of forms in my hand and a $500 filing fee that I couldn't really afford, but knew was the best investment I would ever make. By noon, my 8 acres of land were officially in the process of being protected under Ohio's Agricultural Land Preservation Program. Forever. The beauty of my strategy was its silence. Even if Brenda somehow managed to force me to sell, no developer could ever touch the land. Her massive development deal had just become a pile of worthless paper. But I kept this crucial piece of information locked down tight. I told no one except Denise. Sometimes, the most effective weapon is the one your enemy doesn't even see coming. Let Brenda keep escalating. Let her keep committing crimes. Let her keep building the case against herself. Because when this war finally reached its explosive climax and Harold's recording guaranteed that it would, I wanted her buried so deep under a mountain of her own felonies that she would never threaten another farmer again. The power dynamic had just shifted seismically, irrevocably, in my favor. It was time to let Brenda dig her own grave. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting in my kitchen. The smell of strong coffee percolated in the background as I spread Harold's recorded evidence and my own surveillance files across my grandfather's old oak table like battle plans. "All right, team," I said, looking at the determined faces of the only people I trusted completely. Time to stop playing defense. Denise sat at the head of the table, her laptop open, a dozen legal research tabs filling the screen. Over the past month, she had transformed from a worried wife into a full-time, razor-sharp legal investigator. And frankly, she was better and more thorough at it than most lawyers I knew. "I've been digging into agricultural protection laws all night," she announced. "Charlie, filing for that easement was brilliant, a masterstroke. But we need to go bigger. We need a multi-front assault." Harold, our crucial inside intelligence source, perched nervously on the edge of his chair, still visibly processing the danger of his role. "Brenda's planning something big for this weekend," he reported. The committee meeting got moved up to Friday night, and she mentioned bringing in her professional documentation services again. "You mean that private investigator she hired, Rick Pohl's son," I clarified. "Apparently, he specializes in manufacturing evidence for civil cases." Deputy Sheriff Mike Rodriguez, my old Army buddy who had been quietly advising me, leaned back in his chair with that calculating, thoughtful look I remembered so well from our time in Afghanistan. "Manufacturing evidence for civil cases is a felony, Charlie. If we can prove they conspired to do it, this whole thing becomes a RICO case." That's when I knew we had them. See, back in the 1980s, Congress passed the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, specifically to target organized crime. Most people think RICO only applies to mob bosses and drug cartels, but its legal definition is much broader. It covers any pattern of coordinated, ongoing illegal activity conducted for financial gain. Brenda's systematic harassment campaign, her committee of paid criminals, her fraudulent private investigator, that was textbook racketeering. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, pulling out a legal pad and a pen. "Jake Thornfield is driving down from Columbus this afternoon. He's handled 3 major agricultural fraud cases just this year, and one of them involved successful RICO charges against a development corporation." Denise looked up from her research, a glint of steel in her eyes. "I found the precedent cases. Developers using identical harassment tactics to force land sales. In 2 of those instances, the farmers won civil judgments of over $500,000. $500,000? Harold's eyes went wide with disbelief. "Punitive damages," Denise explained, her voice firm. "For organized harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and tortious interference with business operations." I had married a 3rd-grade teacher, but somewhere along the way, She had become a legal researcher who could quote case law like scripture. The real genius of our strategy came from combining multiple, simultaneous legal approaches. We would hit Brenda from so many directions at once that she wouldn't know which fire to fight first. It would be a legal shock and awe campaign. Rodriguez would take our criminal evidence, the arson attempt, the vandalism, the conspiracy recording, and file formal criminal complaints with the state attorney general's office. Jake would immediately initiate civil proceedings, filing for massive damages and an emergency injunctive relief to halt all of Brenda's activities. Denise would submit meticulously documented regulatory complaints to 3 different state agencies: the Real Estate Licensing Board, the Water Management Department, and the Agricultural Protection Agency. What about the agricultural easement? Rodriguez asked, taking a sip of his coffee. That's our nuclear option, I grinned. Our hidden weapon. She still doesn't know that her development deal is already legally dead. Let her keep committing crimes, keep digging her own grave, while she's chasing a payoff that no longer exists. Jake Cornfield arrived that afternoon looking exactly like a character out of a John Grisham novel, rumpled suit, a briefcase held together with duct tape, and the predatory smile of a lawyer who smelled blood in the water. Charlie, this is beautiful, he said, his eyes scanning the evidence spread across the table. He listened to Harold's recording with rapt attention. Criminal conspiracy, real estate fraud, agricultural harassment. I can file the civil charges tomorrow morning and have her personal and business assets frozen pending the investigation. What about the development company she's working with? I asked. Oh, they're screwed, too, Jake said, his smile widening. Conspiracy to defraud a property owner, bribery of public officials if we can prove the county connection, and definite RICO violations if we can prove this is a pattern and practice for their business. Jake's eyes lit up like it was Christmas morning. I have been waiting my entire career for a case this clean, this righteous. That evening, we laid out our coordinated attack plan in minute detail. Rodriguez would handle the criminal track. Jake would lead the civil assault. Denise would manage the regulatory onslaught. What about evidence collection? Harold asked, his voice still a little shaky. You keep doing exactly what you're doing, Harold, I told him, putting a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You're our inside man. But from now on, everything gets documented. I've got enough cameras and recording devices around this property to film a Hollywood movie. The sweet, earthy smell of evening corn pollen drifted through the open kitchen window as we finalized our strategy. It was a powerful reminder of why this fight mattered so much, not just for my family's financial future, but for every small farmer facing harassment from corporate developers who saw agricultural land as nothing more than a potential profit margin. Jake stood to leave, stuffing stacks of papers into his battered briefcase. Charlie, he said, pausing at the door, within 48 hours, Brenda Hartwell is going to discover that her little real estate scheme has just become the single worst decision of her entire life. What's our timeline? Denise asked, looking up from her laptop. Fast, Jake replied. Her development contract expires on October 1st, which gives us exactly 6 weeks to completely and utterly destroy her entire conspiracy. Jake's predatory smile returned. By the time we're finished with her, she'll be lucky if she can get a job selling magazine subscriptions door to door. As our war council disbanded, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Pure, unadulterated confidence. We had irrefutable evidence. We had top-tier legal representation. We had criminal charges pending. And we had a coordinated, multi-front strategy that would hit Brenda with the force of a legal hurricane. But most importantly, we had the moral high ground, and we had the law on our side. It was time to show this suburban Karen what happened when you declared war on the wrong farmer. With 18 days left on the clock until her development contract expired and financial catastrophe loomed, Brenda Hartwell made the final, desperate decision that would seal her fate forever. Harold's breathless report on Tuesday evening confirmed my worst fears about just how far a cornered, desperate person will go. She's lost it completely, Charlie, Harold whispered, gripping the fence rail so hard his knuckles were white with tension. I overheard her talking to that Pulsland character again. They're planning on creating an accidental fire. A fire that would force an immediate land sale due to financial ruin. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. A fire during the peak of the dry season could not only destroy my crop, but could easily spread to neighboring properties, maybe even threaten lives. It gets worse, Harold continued, his voice barely audible. She's been researching the volunteer fire department's response times, studying wind patterns, everything. She plans to set the fire during next week's countywide training exercise, a time when most of the local crews will be occupied miles away. I felt that familiar, cold combat alertness flooding my system, the hyper-awareness that signals life or death decisions are coming fast. Brenda had escalated from harassment to vandalism, from theft to now, a plan for felony arson. When? I asked, my voice low and steady. Thursday night, Harold confirmed. She mentioned something about making it look like it was caused by faulty electrical equipment on your harvester, and she plans on having a public alibi by attending the city council meeting that evening. That gave me exactly 48 hours to prepare for what would be the final battle of this long and bitter war. Wednesday morning, I drove to hardware stores in 3 different counties, paying cash for a stockpile of fire suppression equipment. I bought portable water pumps, emergency collapsible water tanks, and several containers of flame-retardant chemicals. Everything I would need to fight a fire on my own until professional help could arrive. The acrid, chemical smell of the fire suppressants filled the bed of my truck like a promise of survival. But my real preparation involved a crucial phone call to Fire Chief Danny Morrison, another Army veteran who, like me, understood the critical difference between legitimate emergencies and calculated criminal acts. Danny, I said, getting straight to the point, hypothetically, if someone were planning to commit arson on my property, what kind of evidence would you need to guarantee criminal charges? His weathered face on the video call went grim. High-definition video footage of the fire being set, physical evidence of accelerant residue, and any proof of premeditation, he said. Why, Charlie? Are you expecting trouble? Let's just say I want to be prepared for anything, I replied. That afternoon, I spent hours installing new, heat-sensitive cameras throughout my cornfield. This was military-grade thermal imaging equipment that could detect unusual heat signatures long before any visible flames erupted. I linked the cameras directly to my phone, and with Danny's help, directly to the fire department's emergency dispatch system. I also coordinated with Deputy Rodriguez to have several patrol units standing by in the area on Thursday evening, not close enough to spook Brenda, but positioned for an immediate, overwhelming response the moment the inevitable happened. Harold provided the final piece of crucial intelligence on Wednesday night. She bought the accelerant this afternoon, he reported in a hushed phone call. 3 gallons of camping fuel from that big outdoor store on Highway 33. She paid cash, wore sunglasses, and a baseball cap, but I followed her. And I made sure to browse right near the register when she checked out. Did anyone else see this purchase? I asked. The store's security cameras certainly did, Harold said with a hint of pride in his voice. Thursday evening arrived with an oppressive humidity and a dead calm in the air, perfect conditions for a controlled burn, but terrible conditions for stopping a wildfire once it started. The sweet, heavy scent of ripening corn filled the air, a constant reminder of exactly what was at stake. I positioned myself in my grandfather's old hunting blind at the edge of the woods, a spot that gave me a perfect, concealed vantage point overlooking the back 40. I was armed with night vision binoculars and a direct radio linked to the fire dispatch. Every thermal camera was active, every heat sensor calibrated. My trap was set. If Brenda Hartwell wanted to play with fire, I was going to document every single spark. At 11:47 p.m., my thermal cameras detected movement along the eastern property line. 2 distinct heat signatures, one carrying what looked like large containers, moving systematically through my corn rows. It was Brenda and her investigator, Pol Sun, right on schedule. I watched through the infrared scope as they poured accelerant along a 100-foot section of dry corn stalks, creating what they thought was a clever fire line designed to make the blaze look like it started from a single point before spreading accidentally. Their conversation carried with perfect clarity in the still night air, thanks to the high-sensitivity microphone I had hidden near the fence. Remember, we were never here, Brenda whispered, her voice laced with a nervous excitement. This needs to look like an equipment malfunction. What about the insurance investigators? Poulson asked, his voice rough as he unscrewed another fuel container. By the time any investigators arrive, Brenda replied confidently, Charlie will be so financially desperate to sell that he'll accept any offer we put on the table. These old farmers always cave when they lose a crop. They were committing felony arson while openly discussing their motives for real estate fraud, documenting their own criminal conspiracy in what would be legally admissible, high-quality audio and video. At exactly 11:52 p.m., Brenda flicked her lighter. The corn ignited instantly. The accelerant-fueled flames raced along the pre-soaked line like liquid fire. Within seconds, the blaze was visible from a mile away, a roaring wall of orange light dancing against the dark night sky like some hellish celebration. That's when my network of thermal cameras triggered their automatic alerts, simultaneously notifying the fire dispatch, the sheriff's department, and my personal phone. I had programmed the system to send GPS coordinates, live video feeds, and pre-written emergency response codes the moment any unusual heat signature was detected. The fire trucks were rolling within 90 seconds, a record response time that caught Brenda completely and utterly off guard. I watched through my binoculars as pure panic washed over her face when the first wail of sirens cut through the night, getting closer and closer with every second. She and Poulson tried to flee, scrambling back towards her property, but their only escape route led them directly past the responding emergency vehicles that were now thundering down the road. The expression on Brenda's face when Fire Chief Danny Morrison stepped out of the lead fire truck, his silhouette illuminated by the flames she herself had set, was a perfect, beautiful mixture of pure terror and the dawning, horrified realization that she had just been caught red-handed. "Ma'am, step away from the fire line." Danny's voice boomed with authority. "You're under arrest." The loud, crackling roar of the flames she had ignited provided a fitting soundtrack to the fiery end of Brenda Hartwell's criminal career. "Game over,"